let's talk about settlement procedures for your closing unit. Guys, I think the best place to understand what that question may entail is to go to page 276 in your book. And let's look at the sales contract because it tells you what's happening at settlement. And so if you want to look at letter M, closing, and what's happening here, the legal process, the title's been transferred. It includes the settlement, which means settlement is delivery of all documents, all interested parties, the deed, the settlement statement, the deed of trust, which is the loan, anything that needs to be there to handle this transaction. I'm on the bottom of 275 under settlement, and then the top of 276 under closing. And the closing attorney is going to collect the necessary funds, and then he's going to release the funds after he records the deed and the deed of trust. And remember, the parties who will be there, in your reading it said at closing, generally it's the buyer, seller, broker, a lawyer, and it talks about lender representative, title insurance representative, and I mentioned to you that probably doesn't happen much in real life. Sellers generally run by to sign the deed and the lien waiver for the mechanic liens, and the closing and the settlement really is about the buyer's paperwork, because all these things that are mentioned there, deed of trust and getting the deed and any necessary documents from the lender, all of that will be in regard to the buyer. Now, settlement, so the lawyer goes through all the necessary paperwork. After all the papers are gone through, the deed of trust mainly and the note and all the forms that need to be signed according to the lender, the lawyer will then update the title real quickly, send another attorney opinion to the title insurance company, and the title insurance company will give the final approval. Remember, they gave a pre-approval called the certificate of title at the beginning of the title search. They're going to give the final approval, and the title insurance company will say, conclude by recording documents in their proper order, and then you can release the money and we will issue title insurance. I would remember that the lawyer does send in a form to the IRS, don't they? After the closings, it's called a 1099, isn't it? About income. And it probably has a lot to do with capital gains tax. Remember when we talked about that, we said when we sell our property, it's a taxable event. Didn't we say that? It's a taxable event. So if you wanted to look in your book more specifically, maybe if you went to page 571 and it talks about conducting a closing, and it goes into some of that I just mentioned. Talks about finalizing the closing on page 572, talks about the IRS reporting and those things. Now let's get to unit 17, which is appraising. And you've got a question about the appraisal process. It's really not a hugely detailed question, but if you'll look with me at your very beginning of this unit, let's see if we can find a page here. Page 477 would be where I would look on that. The appraisal process. Where the appraiser is getting the assignment maybe, and he's got to decide what type of an assignment or appraisal is required. They get specific and general data. They determine, which type of appraisal, which types of forms of appraisals are going to do. like the sales comparison approach, the income approach, the cost approach. Oftentimes they're doing all of them, even on residential, unless the lender says don't do the income approach. Remember, they collect the data, and they're going to determine highest and best use early on. This continues to the next page. They estimate the land value. They estimate all three approaches. I would remember when they're concluding, the conclusion of this appraisal is called reconcile. They're reconciling all the information they've gathered from the approaches they did, and they're choosing which approach is the best predictor of the value, and that value under that approach will be the best indicator of value for the property. Remember how we make our adjustments when we do a CMA? Remember, we do CBS. If the comp is better than the subject, we're going to subtract the difference in the amenity from the comp. Everybody good on that? So comp, if it's better, it's kind of like the subject's here and the comp's here. If the comp is better, bring it down to the subject, subtract it. If the comp is inferior, CIA, add, bring it up to the subject. Remember, we're trying to make the comparable look like the subject. The fewer the adjustments, the better. You will be given just a question. Choose the best comp. Remember, we had that in a question at the end of this unit. The question was, let me just refresh you. It says the subject property is 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, 3 baths, and you've got 2 comps. One is a 2-story that sold 18 months ago. One is a ranch level, and which one's best? Neither one. 18 months is too long ago. 1 story is not compatible or comparable with the 2-story. So you'll have a question similar to that. Just looking at which one of these is good enough to use as a comparable. Depreciation types. Well, we know there's the age life, which is a straight line method of depreciation, the same amount over X amount of years. But the type of depreciation I would think that most appraisers use is the breakdown method. And the breakdown method is the physical, the functional, and the economic. So physical deterioration is wear and tear or something structural. The functional deterioration, well, they call functional obsolescence because that word means obsolete, doesn't it? So something out of style, something not desirable anymore like it used to be. And then there's the economic, or called environmental. It's out of the property owner's control, like living near a landfill site. There's nothing you can do about that, and because of the location of it, and your property will be depreciated. Remind yourself that's always incurable. You do need to know the formula for the income approach. If you're looking for, now income approach to value, remember our T-bar? We said part, rate, whole. Remember that? We said we're going to use a lot of math in this formula. So the formula for the income approach is net operating income, and you divide it by the cap rate, and that will give you value. That's the formula for the income approach. Cap rate means capitalization rate. Cap rate means the rate of return an investor expects to be making on their investment. So NOI, and these little dots right here mean divide by the cap rate, yield rate, rate of return equals value. Now, let's remember how to get NOI. NOI, let me use a different marker. NOI is potential gross income minus vacancy equals effective gross income, the real income, more real, minus operating expense, and there's your NOI. Remind yourself that the operating expense does not have debt service in it. Remember? Operating expense is regular operating expense. Your debt service or your principal and interest payment is another expense, but it's not operating expense. You don't have to have the mortgage to operate the business. And if you have the mortgage, it's just it's a decision the investor made. Remember when we learned about cash on cash return? An investor chooses to borrow money as a form of leveraging, right? Leveraging. Alrighty, let's talk about fair housing. Remember your protected classes under federal fair housing and state fair housing. Federal fair housing and state fair housing are the same protected class. There are 7 of them. I would remind myself that age and marital status are not fair housing protected classes. Age and marital status go with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. The lender cannot discriminate on someone's age if they meet the other requirements to qualify. The lender may not discriminate on someone's marital status if they meet the requirements to qualify. Fair housing, the 7 protected classes would be race, color, religion, national origin, gender, familial, and handicap. 7. Exemptions to the fair housing laws. Everyone, I would compare the exemptions under federal compared to the exemptions under state. Remember, under federal fair housing, it's a little more lenient, isn't it? And if you think about it, it's a little more lenient because this Federal Fair Housing Act came out in 1968. And so, we've come further than that. And when North Carolina made their fair housing law in 1983, they said there are things we're not going to allow in our state. So on page 522, you've got the federal exemptions, meaning that if you want to sell your house for sale by owner without a broker and without discriminating ads, that you can pick and choose who you want to sell your house to. If you
Does that include race? Does that include race?
Yes, under federal fair housing.
So 1866 is not.
Well, but that's not fair that's not federal. All right, here's a good question, everybody. There is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. You can never discriminate on race under that law. Federal fair housing says there are some exemptions to this law. And this law says you can pick and choose who you want to sell your house to, even if it's race, under 68. If someone felt like they're discriminated against under this exemption, couldn't they go find a lawyer and the lawyer could say, but this act they're violating, not this act?
So it's the stricter of the two, then?
Well, the stricter of the two under federal and North Carolina would rule, that's for sure. But, and then that would have a play in it too. But I would remember under federal fair housing, the exemption, it didn't say you can pick and choose for religion in this, it says you can pick and choose. So I know that's a little confusing, but what makes it all better is in North Carolina, they say you cannot do that. But federal fair housing, think about it when it came around. Remember I said the lobbyists and the politicians talking and saying, but my people, my constituents think they ought to be able to sell it to whomever they want to. And so they came out with some exemptions. The race is in Civil Rights Act, and the race is not exempted in North Carolina. Anything is exempted under federal. I know it doesn't make sense because we want to say we can't discriminate on race, and we can't these days, but when this first came out, it was in 1968, federal fair housing. And renting out a room, you own the property, and you're living there, so you can rent out a room and pick and choose who you want to rent to. Religious organizations, private clubs. So those are the exemptions there. North Carolina, like Asher said, the exemptions are tighter. There are not as many exemptions in North Carolina. North Carolina says, no, you cannot discriminate when you're selling your own house for sale by owner. We're tightening it up here. And North Carolina says, you know what, if you own a property and one of your family members lives in it, you can pick and choose who you want to live in the other room. And single-sex dorms, and that's about it in North Carolina. Okay? And I know that's a little confusing. We know under federal fair housing, race is protected, but then we have an exemption. And we know under Civil Rights Act, there are no exemptions. We know in North Carolina, the exemptions are just fewer. Americans with Disability Act is for public accommodation and accessibility. It's for the public, not residential. So it would be for businesses, for governmental offices, and just places public will be. Needs to be accessible for anyone with a disability. These terms, redlining, blockbusting, and steering, I want to remind you that blockbusting and panic peddling mean the same thing. So if I had a question and it said something like, this agent is showing a buyer to a neighborhood that she thinks they belong, guys, if you had 4 choices, and if A was blockbusting and B was panic peddling, it couldn't be those because they mean the same thing. Blockbusting and panic peddling are trying to get somebody to list because there goes the neighborhood is what the comment is or was. Steering, though, is showing away from an area you think people don't belong, or showing to an area where you think people belong. And redlining is that lender and the insurance a way to discriminate by marking off areas of a town. We're just not going to lend as much here, and probably the reasoning was minorities and different races and this and that, we're just not going to lend as much there. And now lenders can't get away with it because there are governmental reports that have to be filled in, and which race, and is this person male, female, maybe, I don't know what all the questions are, but they do have to report. Unit 20, environmental issue. Now, there are 2 questions here, so I've got a typo there. There are 2 questions here instead of 1. Does yours say 1 or 2? 1. Okay, there are 2. So you're going to be asked either about asbestos or radon or lead-based paint. So we know lead was banned in 1978. And we know that if you're selling a property, the homeowner would sign off on this addendum. Do they know if there's lead in the paint? If they know, they're supposed to say that they do have to disclose it if they know. And how do you know? And if you've got an inspection or a report, let's give it to the would-be buyer so they can see. This might confuse some students, but the owner does not have to remove the lead. The buyer does not have to test or remove the lead. It would be fully negotiable. Lead in paint is problematic for young children, isn't it? And people that are elderly and ill. But lead paint can be contained or encapsulated. You can paint over it. And generally it's the trim where you see the trim is where usually the paint had the lead in it, because it really kept, it held longer. Like exterior trim paint. Nowadays people have to paint their outside trims frequently. When paint had lead in it, it wasn't as quick of a paint job. It didn't peel and all that like it does now. Even in rentals, remember the lead-based paint addendum would have to be disclosed. Asbestos is dangerous when it's airborne, and we know that it disintegrates as it ages and becomes airborne when tampered with, and disintegrating is called friable, isn't it? When airborne ages and starts disintegrating. When asbestos ages and starts disintegrating. Asbestos can be encapsulated too, which means contained. Or if it's to be removed, it'd have to be removed by someone certified to do that. Radon, you don't see it, you don't smell it, it's just comes up from the earth, and it's dangerous for why? Lung cancer. So it's a ventilation issue, and so if radon is, if the property is tested for radon and it comes back higher maybe than what the EPA is recommending, well then it would be recommended to get a ventilation system. That would be negotiated between buyer and seller if that were the case. And from my understanding, those ventilation systems are not as expensive as we might imagine. Is mold a material fact? No, mold's not a material fact. If you had a question that says, is mold a material fact, the answer is no. If mold is showing up in an unusual part of the house and there's a bunch of it, is it a material fact? Yes. Okay? Because mold, it could be mildew, couldn't it? It could be, yeah, and it is natural. I mean, it's really kind of everywhere. Yeah, bacteria. You know, what kind of got it being such a buzzword, when Ed McMahon, TV personality, when his house was found to be saturated with black mold, and they had to tear the house down, they had to be evacuated, and it just became the news. And now people think that all mold is black mold, and all mold is not black mold. And if it is, and occasionally you'll see, well, y'all probably don't read the paper because you're younger than me, but when I read the paper sometimes, occasionally, you'll see where a house, the owners were evacuated from the property because mold was discovered. You don't see it often though, and that would be the dangerous mold. But if somebody has respiratory problems, any mold would probably be a problem to them, wouldn't it? And it would be the buyer's responsibility to tell you what they need or not need. When we talk about Unit 13, remember that was our investment unit, and we talked about equity increasing. And how does equity increase?
Appreciation of property.
What now? Appreciation of the property, the value going up. Or the loan goes down, Kevin said. If the loan goes down and the value goes up, golly, you're getting it both ways. That's really neat. But also paying money toward principal, which would decrease the loan. So if you add more principal payment to your house payment, that would be beneficial. The business forms of ownership is on page 387 in your book. And we know that when people incorporate, they're incorporating to escape personal liability, aren't they? And it might even be a tax situation there to avoid taxation. Now we know the smaller corporations are taxed one time only when the income's paid to the stockholder, and larger corporations may be subject to being taxed 2 times. You've got LLCs, and in your LLC it says it has the same insulation that a corporation does, and it says it's similar to a partnership, and every owner is a manager in an LLC. When an owner is a manager, they make decisions for the LLC. Partnerships, if they're general partnerships, they just have general partners and they all have decision-making capability. If it's a limited partnership, There will be a general partner or two there also. And remember, we said the limited partners are like the silent partners. We're the ones who put the money up, and that would be what we would be subject to lose if anything were to happen to the entity. All righty, let's go on over to state section. Tenancy by the entirety. Everybody pretty good on that? Or do you have a question? Husband, wife can use that. Husband and wives don't have to use that, but as a way to own. Didn't we say it's default in North Carolina? If you buy property and you're married at the time of the purchase, if you don't say you want to purchase it another way, North Carolina says it's husband and wife, tenants by the entirety, and what do you remember about that? Survivorship. Right of survivorship. So when one spouse dies, it automatically goes to the other spouse, and wills won't interfere. The Timeshare Act, everyone, that was in Unit 2, and the main things about that is knowing what are you buying. You're buying time over time, and the time is at least 5 separate periods over at least 5 times, or 5 years, right? And we know there's a 5-day rescission. We know that there's an extra 5 days added to that, that if there's any down payment money given to the developer, they can't use it for 10 days. Remember that? The timeshare developer can't use any monies for 10 days. And then the other 5 we said in our series of 5s is the $500 fee for, well, we'll call it fine, if a timeshare developer violates any license law. Now that's unusual in one way. In another way it isn't, because it's for unlicensed timeshare developers. And didn't we say that if we get into any kind of trouble, a complaint made, the Real Estate Commission can discipline us by censor, reprimand, suspend, or revoke, but they're never gonna issue a fine on agents. But this would be an unlicensed timeshare developer.
So the money with the 10 days is deposits?
Yeah, deposit. So if someone made, Damien cleared it up, because, yeah, it would be for deposit. If a timeshare purchaser made a deposit, earnest money, or any kind of a down payment, the timeshare developer has to leave it alone for 10 days. All righty. Tax liens, we already know about that, don't we? Oh, by the way, getting back to the timeshare, at the beginning of a timeshare project, it has to be registered with the Real Estate Commission. They get a certificate of registration. And remember, at the timeshare, anyone who sells timeshares has to be licensed broker, and they have to have what we call a project broker, who acts like the broker in charge.
But the developer doesn't, right?
Doesn't what?
need a license.
No, the developer doesn't need a license. All righty. We know about our tax liens and priority, and the effective date is January 1. What about street disclosure? From a developer, the developer has to disclose newly developed areas. Are these streets private or public? And there's going to be a disclosure that would be signed off by the purchaser. Were they built to DOT standards? And is it being maintained by the state? You know, this would be important for a buyer to know. Or are these roads private, which means probably not built to DOT standards and not state maintained? It would be a disclosure that would have to happen from the developer, because this is something that would cost the buyer money down the road. Everyone, it doesn't matter if the streets are in the city or the county, it doesn't matter where the development is. And the other thing is, just because the roads are public, built to DOT standards, it does not mean that the state is maintaining them. It's probably going to depend on how many properties are using that road, how many residents are using it, is probably one of their things that they decide. Now, we talked a whole bunch about the 7 and 8, It looks like we covered it from my angle, but you tell me if you've got any questions. 9 and 10, we talked about that. If you look at Unit 11 and 12 in the state portion, they do ask about the Residential Rental Agreement Act. Now, remind yourself, that did come up in Unit 11, remind yourself that the Residential Rental Agreement Act is a mutually dependent act. Mutually dependent means the renter is responsible and the property manager or owner is responsible. And so this is North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. The main purpose is that only fit and habitable property is to be rented. Fit and habitable. And in your reading what fit and habitable means, main thing is permanent heat, isn't it? So if you're asked, does it include air conditioning? No, it's permanent heat. And fit and habitable also is about safety, sanitary. And if you want to reference, it's 334 in your textbook. It's fit and habitable, safe, sanitary, and this act is mutually dependent, meaning that if something becomes uninhabitable, unsafe, unsanitary, the renter is obligated to send notice to the landlord in writing. And depending on if it's imminent, that needs to be taken care of immediately, the landlord is to respond to that if it's under the fit and habitable. And if they don't, remember we said the renter can use constructive eviction. Guys, landlords don't constructively evict. It's the renter sort of doing that. In a way, we said they're evicting themselves, didn't we? So constructive eviction would be as a result of a complaint made to the landlord about the fit and habitability, and the landlord didn't respond. The renter can move out and then stop paying their rent. They may not stay in occupancy of the property and not pay rent. They cannot withhold rent. That's a breach of the lease, isn't it? Now, if they're in the property waiting for the landlord to come fix something, so they pay the rent, usually it's the first of the month, and so they're living there while it's unfit. If they move out and then stop paying rent, they could seek reimbursement of a pro rata share of the rent while they lived there while it was uninhabitable. They would go to court for that. Alrighty, architectural types. This is unit 16, and so the types would be 1 levels and 2 levels, and they talk about split levels, and they talk about all, maybe a couple of other things, contemporary, but this would be on page 461, the architectural types. And didn't we say that ranch levels are more expensive to build than a typical 2-story because the expensive part of the house is foundation and roofing, and you would need more of it as a builder. It's also, ranches being 1-story are easily to maintain, easy accessible. Lots of people, maybe when they get older, prefer a 1 level instead of the stairs. Now, 2 stories are economical, they're economical to build because you're building up instead of out. Capital gains question, this is not math, this is knowing what the words mean. And remember, I showed you, and let me show you the formula so you can see the words. What unit's that, 18? All right, so let's look at what I was showing you about that. If you'll go with me to page 509 or 508, you see the words in your illustration of how to come up with the gain. So the words are basis and adjusted basis. Really, the adjusted basis is the main thing you want to know what is in that first section. Remember I said when you buy your property, it's the beginning, it's the basis. Well, that's the purchase price. Remember, we can add closing costs that we didn't tax deduct. We can add capital improvement. That column is the adding column. And what do you have in the property is called the adjusted basis. When you sell, it's the minus column. When you sell, you're subtracting your closing cost, and that will leave you amount realized. The difference between the amount realized and the adjusted basis is called the gain or the loss. If this is a primary residence, the owner can be exempted from the gain up to $250 if it's single person, up to $500,000 if it's a married couple filing jointly. If they lived in this property 2 of the previous 5 years as their primary residence. The years don't have to be consecutive, but 2 of the most recent 5 years as your primary, there are some tax exemption for capital gains. If you're selling an investment property, you don't get that exemption, because didn't you get to depreciate your property all along? Now, skip down and you've got a question about square footage. And square footage guidelines in the back of your book, and this is in your appendix C now instead of B. They've added in here your safety section, which is appendix B, just reminding us about that. But appendix C is your square footage. And remember, we talked about this the other day, that the commission doesn't hold us to an absolute perfection when we measure. They don't even make us measure. In other words, when I say make us, it's not a license rule. We don't have to measure our houses, but MLS says you do, don't they? So MLS rules say we want the square footage on the data sheet. And so if you're measuring your property, the commission says you need to know how, and you need to use your best efforts to be as accurate as you can be. And Greg was asking the other day, is there a little fudging room? Yes, there's fudging room of about 5%. And the best way to do would be sketch out the property, measure it on the exterior, unless it's a condo, and then calculate the square footage, just like we did in our area map, width times depth, and you would calculate the square footage. Now, when you're looking at this, pay attention. We had this discussion, if you'll go to page 690, where we were talking about the basement, if the basement's finished, or the attic. How about the attic? Didn't we talk about the knee wall? You would have to come in at least to where it is 5 feet in height, and then you measure the middle, so to speak. As long as this middle part is at least half of it is 7 feet in height, you can count the middle. You can't count all the way over to the wall if the ceilings are sloping. And we talked about the stairs too, didn't we? That the stairs account from the floor to the floor from which they descend. And Greg pointed out, well, what if you've got one of those ornate staircases? Well, this overage here would have to be deducted from the first level, right? I would remember the 3 criteria: permanent heat, completely finished, and directly accessible from other living area. If you have an area that was built without a building permit, you can include it in square footage as long as you notate this area was without a permit. Making sure that that's noted, because we could say that's a material fact, couldn't we, if it wasn't built with a permit. All righty, golly, did we do it? Oh, we did it. Do you have any questions?